I'm too fat and ugly to love, sir, but I can cook. The rancher's answer broke me. The rope creaked like an old promise above the town square of ash thistle. Wind teased the gallows plank, and dust sifted down from the crossbeam as if time itself were shedding skin. Boots crunched, spurs ticked. A circle of faces, hungry, bored, moral for the hour, watched a girl in a torn calico dress kneel on the boards with her wrists bound. The sign around her neck said thief in a brander's brutal hand. Her name was Hattie Dunn. She had rounded shoulders from hauling water, warm hands roughened by work, and a face country men called plain because there was no profit in kindness. Silas Dorn stood to the left of her, a man with a broadcloth vest that looked starched with spite. He owned the mercantile, the grain, the only scale folks trusted because he had convinced them to. He also kept ledgers like a preacher keeps sins, carefully, industriously, never letting any page go blank. Under the gallows they'd set his auction barrel, fresh sawdust on top. He banged a small hammer against it for attention, and the heads of men who only owned tin cups and pride turned. All ears the way men get when cruelty has a price, and they might afford a piece. By order of debt, Dorn said, voice smooth as a snake laid in shade. Miss Dunn is to be sold for the remainder of the winter's flour, $17.08 plus fee. 1 month's labor for every $5 unpaid. She'll cook, she'll scrub, she'll do as told. A murmur rolled across the square like heat shimmer. Hattie's lower lip shook, but she didn't beg. Her eyes were a gray the color of creek water before rain, and when she lifted them the town flinched the way a body flinches from the truth. The baker's wife looked away first, then the blacksmith, then the boys in brimmed hats who had laughed when they pinned the sign on her. Hattie swallowed. I only took a sack when Ma got the fever, she said, voice steady enough to cut a straight line. You told me to pay it when I could. I told you, Dorn said, smiling with his teeth but never his eyes, to pay it, not to lie about it. You owe me. This is the way of owing. He tapped the ledger. This book does not forgive. Someone in the crowd shifted. Leather whispered. A horse blew through its nose. At the edge of the square a vulture circled low, waiting to see whether a heart would die today. Dorn raised his hammer. Let's begin at $5. Who among you wants a hard worker with no bad habits but honesty? 5, a ranch hand called, already laughing. For a week of scrubbing. 6, said a miner with lungs like wet paper. Hattie kept her chin lifted. The rope above her gave one more aching groan as if the town had hung its mercy and walked away. Dorn's smile sharpened. The price rose. A question hung on the air like smoke you can't see through. In a place where law is whatever the loudest man says, who steps in when the rope begins to sing? And when you're alone on the gallows of other people's opinions, who rides for you then? Silas Dorn had a way of standing that turned the whole square into his store. He placed the hammer down and opened his ledger as if there were church bells ringing, and he was about to forgive a sin for a fee. Hattie smelled yeast from the bakehouse, hot iron from the blacksmith, and that other smell. The one that comes when men think they're private in public. It smells like dust and appetite. $8, someone shouted. And when Hattie looked over, she saw Mr. Rusk, a cattle buyer with fingers stained yellow from rolling cigarettes. He winked, slow and rotten. Dorn's voice remained sweet. 8, do I hear 10? He didn't tell them the rest. He didn't need to. Everyone in Ash Thistle knew that Hattie's father had died with his boots on and shovel in hand, digging a ditch for a fence that never got built. He had left Hattie with a half-acre by the creek and a pot with a dent in it. In winter, when her mother's cough turned wet and bloody, Hattie had walked into Dorn's store with the last $2 from the pot and bought flour on credit because there was nothing else to buy, and Dorn had smiled and written careful numbers in a careful book. Now he set that book between the crowd and the girl. The territory allows debt to be paid in labor, he said. A month for every $5 plus fee. The county judge is away, but his clerk is present. He nodded toward a boy in a collar too big for him. The boy nodded back, wanting to be a man the way a calf wants to be a bull. Too quick for its own bones. The miner coughed into a kerchief. 10, he offered. 10, Dorn sang. Sold for 11, came a dry, careful voice from the edge, and heads turned again. But it wasn't a savior. It was Dorn's own whispered plan in boot-heel flesh. Brother Tully, the unstarved one with the thin cross and a belt of scripture. He had a way of bidding when Dorn needed the price to rise. Charity, Tully said, and the crowd nodded, thirsty for that word in a place where water itself was hard to come by. We must make the debt right for her soul. Hattie felt heat rise in her chest. She had tried to pay. She had boiled the last bones 3 times and turned them into stew, and worked at the laundry till her knuckles cracked like old boards and bled too. She'd offered to bake, to spin, to keep the books for Mrs. Wren, who could not read numbers if they stood still long enough to be counted. Dorn had smiled and told her God loved a worker. He loved a payer even more. He raised his chin. 12, said Rusk. His friends snickered. The wind picked up, and the rope overhead scraped wood. Boots crunched behind Hattie, 2 of Dorn's boys closing in, leather belts hanging loose with a certain suggestion. She did not look back. Instead, she looked at the creek that cut the town in 2, and the knees of the cottonwoods and the sky that crouched low and watchful. She thought of her mother's last look. Don't give them your fear, child. Dorn snapped his ledger shut with a soft crack. 12, he said. Sold. The word landed heavy and simple, like a shovel thrown into a wagon. Hattie swayed but kept herself on her knees because she would not give them the drama of falling. Dorn plucked at the sign around her neck as if straightening his own tie. Mr. Rusk, collect your property. The word struck something in Hattie she had not known she had left. She opened her mouth. I can cook, she said to the ground, because the ground would at least hold her. I can bake pan bread the shape of the moon. I can stretch squirrel into stew and make men lick their plates. I can mend. I can stand property, Dorn said, soft as poison. As Rusk's hand reached, another sound braided into the dust and whisper and sin. Not gunfire, not yet. A single set of hoofbeats, unhurried, deliberate, like a man who had all the time in the world and used it for no one else. The crowd turned because even cruelty has to face the door when it swings open. On the far side of the square, a tall, stoved-up roan halted with a soft grunt. The rider did not dismount right away. He was older, 60 maybe or 40 with twice the miles. Hard to tell with men the sun has worked like an anvil. His duster was the color of road and old bones. His hat brim had seen rain and man talk and prayer. He wore his sidearm low and honest. Gray lay in his temples like frost that didn't melt. When he finally swung down, his boots met the dirt with a crunch that said the ground knew him. He looped the reins over the hitching rail, tested the knot with a leathered hand, and only then looked at the gallows. The rope creaked as if to greet him. Silas Dorn's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered like light on a knife's edge. Rancher, he said. The stranger's gaze found Hattie and waited there, quiet and measuring, like a man deciding whether he can carry another man's weight up out of a hole. Is the law for sale today? He asked, voice rasped by wind and time, or just poor women? And the square for the first time went breathless enough to hear how close thunder can be before it speaks. The man's name, the crowd remembered now, was Jonah Hale. He ran cattle on the high long grass south of Ash Thistle, good stock with a deep brand burned clean into hide. He'd buried a wife under a cottonwood and a boy under a sky no doctor knew how to argue with. He kept to himself, which made him trustworthy in a place that had too many talkers and not enough men who could write their name with a fence post. Dorn shifted his weight, set the hammer gently aside, and put pleasantness on like a clean shirt. You know the code, Mr. Hale. Debts are paid in labor when they cannot be paid in coin. You come in late, you get the sermon after the hymn. Mr. Rusk has tendered 12. Sold. Unsell, Jonah said, and the word sounded like something a river might make when it hits stone. Dorn tisked. The law? The law, Jonah said, ain't a trick room you rearrange after folks walk in. He stepped closer. Up close he looked weathered in that way where the wear is in the right places. Fine lines fanned from the corners of his eyes, sun-made. His hands were nicked and healed. The scars were white ropes under brown skin. There was a rope scar, too, around his left wrist. A high story no one in the square knew. The kind that grows a man straight if it doesn't break him. He set a small bag on the barrel. Coins thumped. $17.08. Fee enough besides. Release the girl. Rusk spat tobacco juice onto the dust next to Hattie's knee. Big man, he said. You gonna buy yourself a cook? Jonah didn't look at Rusk. He fixed on Dorn because rotten fruit hangs higher than the boys who throw it. Release the girl. Dorn's tongue touched his teeth. Now, Mr. Hale, I do not mind a rescue. It brings a hymn to the throat. But we must not spoil the code. There are forms. There is a clerk. I see a clerk, Jonah said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He reached into the bag and, with a patient thumb and forefinger, counted coins into Dorn's ledger's shadow. There is the price of flour. There is the price of pretending a ledger is a god. There is the fee of insult. Shame stung the air. The boy clerk looked down at his empty hands and wished they were full of books that were not this one. Dorn hesitated, because he could not decide if Jonah Hale was the kind of man you cut, or the kind of man who would let you discover you were the one bleeding. Finally he smiled again. "Clerk," he said. "Write the release." The boy scrambled. Hattie watched the pen scratch. Her own breath sounded like rope braids sliding over wood. When the clerk passed the paper to Dorn, Dorn made a show of reading it, then slid it across to Jonah. Jonah didn't glance down. He simply nodded to the clerk. "Untie her." The boy looked at Dorn. Dorn looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at the rope. Rusk smirked. It was Hattie who stood on sore knees and set her jaw and lifted her hands. "Cut it," she said to the clerk, a command wrapped in plea. Leather parted with a twang. Blood rushed back into her fingers like the start of a flood. She swayed. Jonah was already there with a steadying hand that did not try to hold more than it must. Easy. She looked up at him then, really looked. Saw the gray, the weather, the kind eyes that knew things other people pretended not to know. Saw the lines at his mouth that said he had not laughed much and wasn't about to apologize for that. She could not stop the words that tumbled out. "Sir," she whispered, shame running reckless ahead of her. "I'm too fat and ugly to love, sir. But I can cook." Silence took the square. It took her too. She wished she could reach out and jam the words back into her throat, like a rag into a pan to stop a leak. But they hung there, raw and wobbling in the sun. The truest thing she'd said since winter breathed into their cabin and turned every pot into a prayer. Jonah Hale considered her not like a man appraising a mule, but like a man listening for a long, familiar sound in a far canyon. His answer came quiet and flat as the plains. "You don't owe a man pretty, Hattie Dunn," he said. "Not to live, not to work, not to be worth a damn. Can you cook?" She blinked fast. "Yes." "Then you'll come cook at my place," he said. "For wages, not penance." Dorn sighed as if bored. "We are finished here," he said to the square. Except he did not give the command. He caught it. He watched Jonah and filed something away in his thin heart for later. "Mr. Rusk," he added lightly, "put your disappointment in your pocket." Rusk did, but he put something else there too. Jonah lifted Hattie's sign from her neck and set it on Dorn's barrel. Slow and careful, like returning a borrowed weapon unloaded. Then he looked at the rope overhead and, with a flick of his wrist, broke the brittle noose knot so it spilled like old hair onto the boards. "If this needs tying," he said, "tie it for yourself." He turned. "Hattie, we ride." The taste of rescue is sharp as lie at first. It burns where the harm has lived. As Hattie put her foot in the stirrup and mounted Jonah's roan behind him, she felt the whole town leaning with eyes. The wind picked up, tossing grit that rattled like small bones against the windows. Somewhere a door slammed. The square held its breath the way prairie holds lightning, knowing what comes next is loud. Because when a man like Silas Dorn smiles thin, it means he's already chosen the timber for the next rope. They rode south under a sky that worked itself into weather the way a man works himself into anger. Slowly at first, then all at once. The land opened, then narrowed, then opened again, as if the world couldn't make up its mind about being generous. Hattie did not speak, and Jonah did not press speech on her. Her hands found the horn and held. The roan's stride loosened into that long carry gait horses learn when they've taken one man and his ghost too far to come back empty. Boots crunched when they finally swung down at Jonah's home. It wasn't much to look at. A low-slung ranch house whose shoulders hunched against the wind like a tired animal. A windmill made of wood gone silver as old scars. A small corral. A cook shack with a stovepipe that pointed straight up like a stubborn prayer. The place was tidy in that stern way that says, "We survive here on purpose." "You can bunk in the cook shack for now," Jonah said. "We'll talk after supper," she nodded. He gave her space and hands both, showing where the flour lived, the beans, the salt pork, the coffee. He watched without hovering as she lit the stove and shook pan bread together by feel. Water, pinch of salt, handful of flour, and slicked the pan with lard until it shone. The smell rose fast and real. She made coffee so strong it might have walked. She fried salt pork till edges curled like pages in a hard book. Oil popped. Rope creaked out at the windmill. A storm built itself in the west. While she worked, Jonah stood outside under the eave, rolling a cigarette and watching the road like you watch a wound you know will open again. His eyes cut the horizon in squares and placed them carefully where a man might ride out of them. He had seen Rusk look the way he did. He knew Dorn would not let a ledger be rewritten without recompense. Men like Dorn believed the world owed them interest on pain. They came at first lights dying, 3 riders, then 5, then the kind of number that puts another notch in silence. Jonah flicked his cigarette into a puddle and called through the door, calm as if the coffee had cooled. "Hattie, you keep low. What do they want?" she asked, wiping her hands on her dress and reaching for the skillet like it was a shield. "Something they can't have." He drew his gun and checked the loads with a motion so practiced it did not belong to thought anymore. "Stay behind the stove." "Iron and brick are friends," Rain began. It ran like snakes down the eaves. The windmill moaned. The riders fanned and closed, their horses hissing through bit foam. Boot soles hit wet clay with that sucking sound that tells you how hard a fall will be. Silas Dorn was not among them. Of course he wasn't. He had better boots than Mud would like. Rusk was, smile oily under the brim. "Evenin' Hale," he called. "We come for what's owed." The girl defaulted on employment by emancipation. Jonah frowned. "You can't even hear yourself," he said. "Go home." "Home's where the pay is," Rusk said, and he raised his hand. Gunfire split the rain like a thing made for the job. Jonah's first shot caught the closest rider's hat and made it jump like a rabbit shot late. The second knocked a gun hand from its own owner. Shots came back messy, eager, loud. The cook shack bucked under Hattie's palm. She dropped to the floor behind the stove, heart laddering high enough to bang on her throat. A bullet kissed the skillet on the stove with a hard ring and flew into the wall, flattened. The pan spun, wobbling on its handle. Hattie's eyes snapped to it, the way it had warped and gone oddly beautiful for having lived through heat and a bullet both. She grabbed the pan, snatched a rag, and edged to the window. Rain poured off the eave like rope. She could see silhouettes, men crouched, mouths open on curses that got swallowed by thunder. She could smell that hot, wet scent of gunpowder, and something else, older, the way dirt smells when it's about to take a body back. A shadow swung around the corner of the cook shack, a boy with a new mustache and eyes like he'd been told how brave he was twice too early. He saw her and grinned as if he'd treed something. "Oh, I got—" Hattie stood up into his surprise and brought the skillet down hard across his forearm. Bone spoke, not a scream, but that pop like a knuckle popped wrong from the inside. He cried out. His gun hit the mud. She didn't think. She swung again and caught Temple. He fell into the puddle the way a calf falls asleep, loose, helpless, except his blood made a small red necklace in the rain. Outside, Jonah kept time with himself. He moved like an old tree that had learned the wind's language and knew when to bend. One shot at the rail post where a man hid, a ricochet off the pump handle to make another duck. Thunder rolled. The windmill creaked like bones remembering their job. The riders hesitated because things that should have been easy were suddenly honest work. Rusk tried the door, found it latched, and snarled. "Dorn says the law's with us." "Dorn says a great many things that keep his hands clean," Jonah answered. "Go home." A shape broke from the edge, a man with a lariat who thought rope was meant to choke. Jonah saw him a tick too late. The loop landed, jerked tight, and bit Jonah's shoulder. He stumbled. The rope sang as the horse hit pull. Jonah's boots dug tracks, his teeth set. Hattie, wild with a courage she didn't have time to doubt, yanked the door and stepped onto the porch. Rain drenched her hair. Slippery wood groaned. She swung the skillet once, twice like a bell ringer calling men to church. "Let him loose," she shouted into the weather. The man with the rope laughed, turned to see who dared, and Jonah used the inch. He dropped to one knee, fired, and cut the rope right where it kissed Rain. The man reeled. The horse screamed. The loop fell like a snake that had forgotten its purpose. Jonah rose slow, rope burn blooming bright on his coat. Rusk saw it all and made a choice with the kind of smile that grows on men who think they'll live forever. He leveled his pistol at Hattie. "Move," Jonah said, but there wasn't time. Rusk's finger tightened. Hattie lifted the skillet by instinct. The bullet hit iron, shrieked, and tore the pan clean from her hands. It clanged across the porch, smoking like a new planet. Rusk blinked in disbelief at the world's refusal to cooperate with him. And in the heartbeat where Luck was still thinking about who it belonged to, Jonah stepped into the line of fire. The second bullet never found the place it had promised to go. Jonah's shot reached Rusk first, neat and merciless. The cattle buyer sagged like a sacked tent, surprise still on his mouth. Rain took the news to the dirt fast. The other riders looked at one another with that empty inventory men run when the one who told them what they were narrows into silence. "Pick him up," Jonah said, breath steady but shoulders loud with pain. "Take him to town and tell Dorn the ledger's closed." No one argued. They lifted Rusk the way men lift a thing that has gone heavier after it stops demanding. Hooves churned mud. The windmill slowed to a pensive creak. Then the riders were only a gray smear moving away, rain erasing their lines. Hattie stood very still with her empty hands, arms shaking now that the work was over. Jonah bent, gathered the ruined skillet and tested its warping with a thumb. He let a corner of mouth tip up. "Too pretty to throw," he said. She couldn't find a laugh inside herself yet, but something near it stirred. "I can fix it," she whispered. "Heat and a little weight." He nodded. Same as most things. They moved inside. Hattie set coffee in front of him, then saw the rope burn under his coat and winced. "You're hurt." "I know," he said, as if injuries were old neighbors with whom he'd run out of conversation. She reached for a basin, tore a strip from the underskirt she'd sewn too long anyway, boiled water, and washed that angry welt with hands that had learned to be careful on nights no one wrote down. Jonah watched her without flinching. When she finished, he said, "Thank you." They ate pan bread torn by fingers and dipped in coffee because there were no plates left unshaken. Outside, rain slackened to a hiss. The storm moved east to argue with someone else. Hattie tried to say any of the 100 words the day had trapped in her, but only one came right.
"Why?" she asked.
"Why me?" Jonah leaned his elbows on the scrubbed table and looked at her head on, the way he'd looked at the square, at Dorn, at the rope, at the road. "Because a town that puts a rope over a woman for flour deserves to be told no," he said. "Because men like Dorn count a life wrong and pretend the math is righteous. Because I got tired of feeding grief and calling it grit." He glanced at the skillet on the counter, black and bent and stubborn as sin. "And because you said you can cook." Hattie's chin trembled in that ungovernable way truth sometimes breaks a face. Tears came hot and private. She let them, because to keep them would be to store something that did not need to be preserved. When she could, she wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I can," she said. "I will." "You will," Jonah agreed. "For wages. For as long as you want. Then for better wages somewhere that deserves you more." He paused. "And for supper tomorrow, make that rabbit stew a man would think about when he's fencing in the wind." "If you know how." She did. She told him so. He nodded like a man who had already tasted it in his mind. They spent the evening repairing what could be repaired. Hattie hammered the skillet flat under the heel of her palm and a length of board. Heat first, then patience. Jonah retied the windmill rope and spoke to it low when it complained. He fed the roan and checked his tack twice as if habit were a sacrament. When darkness came soft and colder, he walked the perimeter once and came back smelling of sage and resolved decisions. Before he turned in, he stood in the cook shack doorway. "Dorn will try again," he said. "Not with riders next time. With paper. With a man who wears a coat with a seal on it." "I have no money," Hattie said. No shame left to attach to the saying of it. "You have work," he said. "You have hands. You have me for the arguing." She looked at him full. "You don't have to." "I don't owe a man pretty," he said gently, returning her courage to her in the shape of his own words. "But I owe this land one less ledger, and I owe myself not to look away." Something took root in Hattie then that had nothing to do with owing. It felt like a light starting where cold had set up its bunk. She slept that night with the rain talking itself tired on the roof and the smell of coffee in the room and the sound of rope at the windmill, telling the night it had a purpose after. All Hunselsdorn waited a week before he sent the man with paper. Jonah and Hattie were ready. Jonah had ridden to the county seat with a different ledger, the one with receipts and the forged signature he'd pried from a clerk who had been a boy not long ago and had not made up his mind about what kind of man to be. He brought back a letter with an embossed stamp and a single sentence that undercut Dorn's page of tricks. Debt satisfied. Unlawful sale enjoined. When Dorn read it on the edge of Jonah's porch, the windmill creaked just once in something like laughter. Hattie stood behind the stove with her hands on the skillet's new old handle. Her cheeks were flushed from heat and victory both. Dorn's face made a long journey from smile to neutrality, to the place men go when they have to swallow something they plan to feed others. He tipped his hat to Jonah in a gesture that was all angles and no respect. "This isn't the end," he said. "No," Jonah said. "It's the beginning of your education." Dorn turned his boots in the yard and left. The dust that raised behind him didn't stick. A month later, after Rusk's brothers tried to take the windmill and found it bolted to the earth and watched by a woman with a pan that could ring a man's bell, Dorn discovered the railroad had selected a feed supplier who kept cleaner books. Folks stopped smiling around him on purpose. The rope at the gallows rotted without hands to tend it. That winter, Hattie cooked for Jonah's crew, and then for the widow Wren's new boarding house with a kitchen big as a promise. Men came for her biscuits and stayed because the room felt like a place a person could heal without anyone naming it that. Hattie's laugh came back and surprised her. It sounded like a creek stone turned in a generous hand. When she passed a mirror, she saw a woman with round cheeks flushed from a stove, eyes steady as fence posts, and a mouth that knew its own mind. Pretty had never been the point, and in any case, she looked like someone Jonah Hale would trust with his back. That was its own kind of beautiful. At the spring branding, Jonah stood at the edge of his corral and watched calves complain about the future. Hattie came to the fence with a tin plate stacked with pan bread and a strip of steak seared hot enough to remember the pan's past. She handed it up. Their fingers touched. He did not glance down at the skillet scar on her palm, and she did not flinch from the rope burn on his wrist. These were truths, not wounds. He chewed. He nodded. "That'll make a man mend fence he doesn't even own," he said. And Hattie grinned until the sky caught it and tried it on for color. That night, under a quiet so-hole you could hear a rabbit think, Hattie sat on the porch step with her skirt hem tucked under her boots and asked herself a question that did not bruise. If I had to choose again, between fear and the pan, between ledger and rain, between shame and work, what would I do? She already knew. And you, if you were in Hattie's place, with a town weighing you in pennies and a rope singing over your head, what would you do? Would you bargain with men like Dorn, or would you wait for the sound of boots crunching and a voice that says you don't owe a man pretty to be worth a damn? Tell us in the comments. If this story gripped you, if you felt the windmill's bones, the ropes creak, the skillets ring, like this story and subscribe for the next Wild West tale. And if you want to see how the next battle unfolds, don't miss the next story. Subscribe now.